Welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Today, I got investor Bobby D, formerly known as Robert Dylina, but I am so excited to have him on the podcast today because he is actually on the board of directors for his local housing authority, Merced County. He's going to bring a wealth of experience from his incredible journey with his real estate investing journey from construction background and all the way to all the nonprofit stuff that he does today. Without giving it all away, Bobby, welcome to the show, man. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how'd you even get started in real estate investing, man?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Kent. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about the things that I'm participating in. Um, so gosh, my background has been wide and diverse. I tell people that I'm really ultimately on my third career now at this point. But here's the real quick breakdown on my history and how I ended up investing in real estate. So I was at a young age one of the very nerdy kids that would prefer to be indoors on on a computer that rather than outside, playing and doing whatever else kids like to do these days. So I went into computer engineering at Cal Poly here in California, straight out of high school. I mean, literally straight out of high school. Like I
Hmm.
graduated and 2 weeks later, I was in the dorms. I did one of their Head Start programs and got an early jump on it. What happened is I got a little bit burned out on the tech world in general. While I was doing my degree, I was about 3 years in or whatnot. And during that time, I was working two jobs. I was working one in IT, and then I was also working in construction. I started doing construction just because a buddy of mine was working in construction, and I needed some extra cash to, pay for school and car and cell phone insurance. You know how the bills stack up when you're young. And so I started working in construction part time with him, and so as I got burned out, I was like, I'm watching these contractors, they're making good money, they're outdoors swinging a hammer. This seems kind of cool. Why don't I transfer majors to construction management? And so that's what I did. So switched to that. This was actually where I really started to get into, I guess you could call it real estate, right? I'm working on building buildings at this point. But I graduated with a degree, came back to my hometown, and uh, started working basically right off the bat. I had lined up a job with a local developer, and that developer, I ended up working for all the way through the housing collapse. So we're talking 2007, 2008,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The Great Recession. So I started out with that developer as a assistant superintendent and then superintendent of construction. I supervised the construction of about 400 some homes all up and down Merced County and even outside of Merced County for this regional developer. The collapse started, and I managed to stay on as one of the last few employees in the company as they were sort of rolling things up for about a year or so. And but obviously I saw the writing on the wall. I knew my time was limited. So I actually started going back to school in the evenings, got another degree in business administration with a concentration in finance because I figured, hey man, as long as there's money, there's going to be people that need to be pushing the numbers around, right? So I'll get into finance. I got I did very well the second time around. It's amazing how much focus you can have in college when you're a little bit older and going out and having a few beers or 10 beers on a Friday night, isn't as appealing anymore. And so I did really really well. I ended up being finance student of the year and got all these awards and whatnot. And because of that, a recruiter with a mortgage company had saw some of my, post online where I'd posted my award from the ceremony or whatever. And I got recruited into mortgage finance. And that has been probably my mainstay, I would say, my primary work for the last
Hmm.
little over a decade. But during that time, I've also started to apply the things that I have learned from my other experiences in the past. So, for example, I now develop raw land and real estate. I'm
Wow.
very, very young in the process, right? I'm not, developing 150 lot subdivisions or greater. Right now, I've got 73 lots in various stages of entitlement spread across 3 small projects. But I'm about 2 years in, so you just kind of keep snowballing that as it goes on. So that's one of the ways that I'm investing in real estate. On top of that, there is I am partnered in 2 investment groups. One that focuses exclusively on multifamily and large portfolios, and another one that we do more of a direct to seller marketing, like you would experience through
Hmm.
like Sub2 and other communities like that, where we have a team of VAs that are calling down lists that we get. Um, we were previously pulling data from online sources like batch leads, prop streams, the
Yep.
folks
Yep.
like that. We found a better way to do it, going directly to the counties instead of going through prop stream and batch leads. So that's where our data comes from, and we pick up a lot of properties that way as well. In addition, my last way that ties all into the real estate investment is going back to my roots with software development. So you and I only talked about this
Hmm.
briefly prior to today's call, but tech has always remained a passion for me, even though I got burned
Hmm.
out during school. And so I do volunteer my time after work to teach web development to basically that we call them underdogs, people that otherwise wouldn't have had access
Love it.
to this kind of training or ecosystems to get involved in tech. And with a company called Bitwise. Bitwise focuses exclusively on underdog communities. So in
Got
communities
it.
that have below average area median incomes, economic struggles of some kind. And how that ties into real estate investing is I'm actually in the process of standing up a software solution to help investors underwrite properties. So
That's super cool.
I've got a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of stuff going on. I stay pretty busy between the day job doing lending for people, and then plus all of the stuff that I do after hours as well. So that's kind of the
Oh
rundown
man.
professionally for me. And then of course we've got
Bo-
all the volunteer stuff stacked on
oh
top
my
that you and I have talked
God.
about.
Bobby D, you are legendary, man. The amount of work that you're doing, the amount of the different careers you've had. I mean, I'm so excited that you decided to come on the podcast, right? When I first just listened to you for the first time, it's like, wow, this guy has so much value to kind of offer to someone young like me, that's just trying to get started and trying to learn as much as possible and soak everything up like a sponge. But, let's take it from the beginning, right? You
Yeah.
talked about construction, you talked about finance,
Yeah.
now you're doing developing land. Let's go back to the beginning really quick and just talk about like,
Yeah.
hey, supervising construction of almost like a couple hundred homes, that is really daunting, man. Like,
Yeah.
so let's talk about what did you learn in that process and what were like the biggest challenges you think coming
Oh
up from that
boy.
job that you learned?
Back to the construction days. Yeah, that was a tough schedule depending on the week and what was going on.
Hmm.
We built houses on a release schedule. So
Got it.
whatever corporate said was going to be our release schedule, that's what we adhered to. Sometimes we were starting 2 new homes a week.
Got
Sometimes
it.
we were starting 10. Um, but yeah, that was an interesting time for me because here I was fresh out of school with a construction degree,
Hmm.
and I had had some experience working in the actual trades, but it was mostly framing, plumbing, and electrical. Those were the
Got
three
it.
things that I was learning during those days.
Hmm.
Now I had to basically learn every other trade so that I could supervise them, right? You have to kind of know what's going on in order to be able to tell somebody, hey, that's not done right or whatnot. So that was a really transformative period for me. And it was a lot of spreadsheets to keep
Hmm.
track of everything, had to walk every single house at least twice a day, once in the morning,
Got it.
once in the
Wow.
evening. If I was monitoring at some points in time, I was monitoring more than one or building more than one subdivision. So I'd have to drive from one to
Hmm.
the other. But I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges in construction, but this applies everywhere, is interpersonal relationships.
Yep.
On every house, we've got anywhere from 40 to 60 subcontractors working on that house. And managing all of those relationships successfully and getting the desired end result out of everybody is a lot more difficult than you might think that it is. And heaven forbid one contractor, is late on a specific project, because
Mm-hmm.
that pushes back, in general, not always, but in most cases, it pushes back every other trade behind them. And then those people already had, maybe they are planning to do the electrical on lot 23. Well, shoot, now lot 24 was behind schedule. Now they have to bundle up 23 and 24 and manage to do it all in one day. And that creates a lot of internal strife. There's always disagreements, especially between the
Yes.
subcontractors themselves. Oh, that's your mess. You need to clean that up. Oh, you did this. Oh,
Oh
that's not my
man.
job. And navigating that whole thing, that was probably my biggest takeaway, was just learning by doing how to manage relationships between other people, and then of course between myself and the subcontractors.
Oh
That
my
was actually
God.
my biggest takeaway, not the actual construction knowledge. That I
Mm-hmm.
love it. It's phenomenal. I do a
Yep.
lot of remodel work on my own projects just for
Mm-hmm.
fun, not because I have to, but because I like it. But that knowledge was not the lifelong takeaway for me. It was managing those relationships.
And that is so cool, right? And I love that you called out managing relationships because that is almost interconnected with how you got to sequence the work when you're handling construction for so many houses at once, right?
Yeah.
So you have 2 to 10 houses, you might have someone that like, "Hey, the grade is a grading done before the pavers kinda come in," right? And you're just like, "Well, whatever rains on one day." Then you get all this finger pointing, and the analogy I use sometimes for this stuff is like when you're
Mhm.
running a restaurant and, a food comes out cold or something like that, the kitchen might say like, "Well, the server never came in to bring the food out, so it's been sitting there for so long."
Right.
And then they're gonna be like, "Oh, no, it's the kitchen's fault. They didn't serve it on time or they didn't wait for me," right? It's kinda all this finger pointing, and people underestimate how much work there is to manage those relationships and also to think about like the massive amount of coordination and sequencing that has to take place for construction. So I love that you kind of just pulled the curtain back on that process, Bobby, and just showed people like, hey, you can probably ask if you have an electrical question or a plumbing question, chances are you can probably call around and get the right answer. But when you have delays on a job, that's where things really get complex, and you got to make sure you have the budgeting to account for that stuff. So
Yep.
maybe if I were to ask
Absolutely.
a question like, how much time do you leave in between? Like you must have managed enough projects now where like, hey, typically we see delays here, typically we see delays here. Do you already build in those sort of delays with between subcontractors, or is it like corporate says you got to hammer this out? This is the
Yeah.
deadline. Figure it out. What do you think?
So in our schedules, I got pretty good at this. And once you've
Mm,
got good relationships with your subcontractors and good subcontractors to begin with, right? We're quick to hire, but we're quick to fire as well,
right.
right? And in reality, that sounds kind of heartless, but it's the only way to truly succeed, and to create the best experience, not just for yourself, but for everybody else that's dependent on that person, or that subcontractor.
Hmm.
So we got the right people in the right places, and we knew what to expect from them. In total, on let's say a single story build, I got to the point where we only had about 2 days of buffer built in.
Wow.
And those were usually built in during periods where we knew that there were potential issues or there would be weather delays.
Got it.
Um,
Got it.
on a 3 or 2 story building, we were putting in anywhere from 3 to 4 days worth of buffer, depending on the time of year. It was a lot of it's dependent on rains.
Wow, that is well, it helps that you have a lot of experience, and I'm sure that has translated to what you're doing now, right, Bobby? You mentioned that you're a part of a team in multifamily now as part of the investment group and also in Dr. Seller. For let's take a step back actually. Let's go into the land development. So
Yeah.
how did the skills from all your construction background help you
Ooh.
with all this land that you're thinking, like, what are you looking out for? Like, what have you learned that you're applying and you're like, oh wow, I've seen this before. Now I can prevent that from happening. But what kind of new things are you running into when you're not developing raw land?
Yeah. So land development, we didn't really talk about my all of my volunteering that I do outside, but there's one of those that is very relevant to this, and I'll bring that up in a second.
Yeah, let's do it.
Um, you're absolutely 100% right. The experience working for a developer, especially on the construction side, has enhanced what I'm able to do on the development
Hmm.
side because I know what to expect from our contractors. That skill translates basically one for one.
Got it.
The area that I really picked up, I would say, the most knowledge in how to get to that point to go from raw land to a developable lot was
Hmm.
actually through volunteering. And that volunteering took
Interesting.
the form of sitting on my city's planning commission. So I
Wow.
just recently retired from my city's planning commission 3 months ago because I
Got
termed
it.
out. I spent 8 years
Wow.
on the planning commission. And on the planning commission, that's one of the things that you see typically is development proposals, engineering, you're approving
Hmm.
conditional use permits, all kinds of stuff that have to do with entitling land is what the
Yep.
process is called. And that really opened my eyes and pulled back the curtain for me. And even then, it still took years. I was on the planning commission for probably what, 6 years
Hmm.
before I attempted to do it on my own and felt like I at least knew enough to be dangerous and, take some scary action and jump in and try it for myself. And I did. I started with a very small I bought one lot that I knew, I could subdivide into 4, and it just went from there. The 4 turned into the next project was 21, turned into 36, turned into 73.
Wow. I mean, what a journey that was. I mean, so if someone is new, right? Obviously, they
Mhm.
should not get into raw land development. But if they were just to like say, "Hey, I want to invest in a deal that has to deal with raw land," what type of questions do you think they should ask about the land to make sure like they're not investing in like garbage, for lack of better
Ooh,
words?
so many questions. So many questions. And, this is why not everybody does land development, right? There's
Hmm.
there's a depth of knowledge needed to make sure that you don't end up, getting yourself in some trouble.
Yeah.
So, at the end of the day, and this varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Keep in mind, I'm in California, right? So we have a lot of extra regulation on top, specifically as it relates to development that some other
Hmm.
states don't have. But some of the fundamentals still are in place. So, for example, you find a piece of land and you're thinking, maybe this might make a good real estate development with some, let's say, single family
Hmm.
homes. Number one, does does the land reside in a county or is it part of a city or is it within a city
Mm.
sphere of influence? These are all different boundaries that get drawn by governments, right? That oftentimes have an impact on when and how a piece of land
Yeah.
can be developed.
Hmm.
Let's say you ID a piece of property and you're like, gosh, it'd be great to have, some houses here. Well, maybe the city's general plan calls for that area to be industrial and they're not
Hmm.
willing to budge on that. That's probably not something that you necessarily should be
Big
buying
zoning
banking
issue.
on. Yeah, they may not allow you to change the general plan, but then again, maybe they might. Would it be consistent with the area? Is there surrounding uses that are similar? Is there some reason that this would make a good area
Hmm.
for residential versus industrial? Does the city have a need for industrial and that's why they zoned it there? In which case they now need to find somewhere else to put in the general plan or the zoning for industrial if you offset here. These are all things that are considerations. More tactical stuff outside of planning, where are you gonna get your water, sewer, and storm drainage if
Yes.
necessary, right? That's a big deal. And no matter what state you're in, typically you're dealing with NEPA, which is, the national EPA regulations about environmentals. So you need to identify where your water is going to come
Hmm.
from. Is it going to come from a
Hmm.
well, or are you going to tie into some kind of municipal source with a city or county?
Got it.
If you could be in a water district where that land might have to enroll as part of the water district. Well, here's another wrench to potentially put in the works. There are things, it's typically called a can and will serve letter. That's a letter from a water district or a sewage district or whatnot that basically says, hey, we have capacity to serve your project
Got it.
and we will serve it. Now, just because your land is part of a water district doesn't mean that they necessarily have capacity. They might be at
Yep.
capacity right now. Maybe they're planning
Mm,
for their next, well to be drilled. They might come to you and say, well, if you really want to develop this land, you got to kick in $500,000 towards our next well. Those kinds of things happen through development agreements. So just looking at the overall plan for that piece of land as it relates to what the county and or city says,
mhm,
um,
mhm.
and the water sewer infrastructure, that's about two key pieces out of what I would say ultimately ends up being probably 10.
Yeah, so it's kind of like part of due diligence. You have to figure out whether or
Yes.
not the zoning is in place, whether or not the city even agrees with the development approach. Because sometimes these
Mhm.
conversations usually happen before you really go further on land, right? This seems like a huge
Yeah.
investment if all parties are not on board. This is really where your private and public really kind of come together and have that
Yeah.
conversation, especially when it comes to infrastructure, right? It's like you gotta have water. People take that stuff for granted sometimes, man. You
Uh-huh.
gotta have a way to live. So that's really cool. Thank you for kind of walking me through that. That's really, really helpful. And is your exit strategy with this land, are you trying to develop buildings on it, or are you just trying to sell off the land once it's kind of gotten its entitlement and everything? What does the exit
Yeah.
strategy look like?
So for me and my partner right now on the development side, we're trying to eke every bit of profit we can out of the
Hmm.
development. So we're not focusing on just flipping the land. There are people that do that. They'll go buy a
Hmm.
piece of land, develop it, sell it off to Lennar, DR Horton, Centex, the
Hmm.
big national builders.
Yep.
For us, that's not our business plan. Um, we're relatively new, so there's very few projects in the big scheme of things that we can afford, right? We can't go
Hmm.
buy 100 acres, for $5 million and then spend another 6 million building it
Yeah.
out, right? We're not there yet. So we need to scrape every bit of profit out of the build as we can. So we're doing all the way from raw land to the finished home.
Got it. And what does that timing even look like from the time you got the planning to getting the home up and to actually
Yeah,
selling it off? Like this sounds like it can take forever because there's so many conversations that's going on, right? But you can just
it
demystify
can.
that process. Like what can people really realistically expect? Because that's another way we can qualify things, right? When people have way too optimistic expectations, like, oh, we can go with this in a year. You're like, what? No, are you sure?
So again, keep in mind, I live in
Okay.
California and the regulations here are way over the top. I mean, the states even recognize it's a problem now
Mm,
because there haven't been enough homes built. We've
yes.
got a shortage of over 1 million homes in just California alone. And a
Hmm.
lot of that is because the regulations have become too onerous, too hard to navigate, and almost anybody can sue to stop a development project. They may not successfully stop it, but they'll
Hmm.
waste a bunch of your money for, a year or two. So
Got it.
the timelines here are protracted versus some other areas. But fortunately, we do a lot of due diligence, as you might imagine,
Yes.
before we even buy a piece of land, right? I'm running
Hmm.
down that list of 10 items very early on so that we know we have at least a 99% chance of having a successful development.
I like that
So
number.
from the time we close on the land, usually at that point, we're going out to bid right away for um, engineering and surveying.
Mhm.
That's usually going to take, depending on the size and scope of the project, that's going to take you at least 2 to 3 months just to get that done. Once you submit into whatever the relevant agency is, whether it's
Mhm.
county or city, you can expect that process usually around here to take another 30 to 60 just for first review. They'll come back with
Mhm.
comments, additions, corrections, changes that they might want. Go back again to engineering, figure another couple weeks to a month to do those changes. Back to the municipality again, and that process just iterates over and over again
Yep.
until you've got it successfully done. In general, we try to aim for 2 submissions, 3 max, ideally, hopefully.
Got it.
Um, but once you've got that whole process kind of dialed in about how it should be, then you start involving the public facing parts of the municipality. Now,
Mm,
in some cities and counties, the planning commission has absolute authority to approve subdivisions. In others, they don't. They give it kind of a first look, say that they find it compliant and it looks good to them, and then it goes up to either the city council, board of supervisors, whichever is relevant. And at that point, then you've got public input and all kinds of stuff going on,
yes.
and you have elected officials making decisions. Um, Assuming that you make it through that process, and your tentative map is good to go, that'll usually record 30 days later after you have your tax certs and all of that fun stuff. And then you move on to final map. Now, yeah. So now you need to actually put in place a final map that goes through essentially the same process. In my municipality here, in general, once you've gotten to final map, there's not much that can stop the
Hmm.
process. It's really a consent item from there on out, which means it's
Got it.
just a low priority item that generally just gets adopted by your council or board of supervisors without being individually reviewed. It's like adopted as part of a group of items that are just ongoing common business. But once that's recorded, now the work actually begins. So you're probably a year in at least at this point, if not a year and a half. That's kind of the average turnaround time to take a
Hmm.
raw piece of land to fully entitled. Even though hypothetically, technically, this whole process should be able to be done in less than 6 months, never works out that way, ever.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for clarifying that.
yeah, I mean, if you followed the legal timelines, like using the maximum or minimums, you could complete entitlements in 6 months. It just never happens.
You're
There's
counting on
ways.
people responding to the emails right away, like, "Oh, boom, you got it back. I'm gonna work on this right away." It just doesn't work like that. It's unrealistic.
It doesn't work like
Holidays,
that.
vacations, yeah. I
Yeah.
think that's super, super well explained, and thank you so much for walking through all those steps. It was
Yeah.
super, super clear, and I'm sure all the listeners out there right now are like, "Wow, I gotta work with Bobby D if I got another land deal going on because this guy really knows what he's doing." So,
Hey, if you got a
uh,
land deal, bring it. We're looking to
yes,
operate outside of California now, so we're looking to grow a
love
little
it.
bit.
Love it, love it, love it. Well, so we talked a little bit about the land development, right? Now
Yes.
you're into multifamily and you got a little direct to seller kind of wholesale marketing operation. What is your role now? Like, where does a team benefit the most from having you on a team? Is it like, are you consulting on construction approaches? Are you there to raise capital? Where have you found your sweet spot to be? Just because like we learn a lot about the avatars and stuff too. We learn a lot
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
how people can succeed in certain roles the best. What have you found to be kind of your niche now, so people know how to reach out to you and best take advantage of your strengths?
You were talking about Avatar. I was looking at my desk here to see. I have my copy of Rocket Fuel sitting right around here somewhere. But yeah, so my role on the multifamily side. So on the single family side, I do help to raise capital. That's one of my roles
Hmm.
with the single family side, which you and I haven't talked about the Capital Call, which is a brand that we
Hmm.
talked very briefly about the social media stuff. But on the multifamily side, my area of operations, I'm actually very closely both an integrator and a visionary both. I do my integrator side outranks my visionary by,
Got it.
10-15%. So I've got kind of an interesting mixture in my personality of what I like to do and what I'm good at.
Hmm.
And it tends to be systems driven.
Love it.
So in all of my companies, I end up being the one that incorporates the business, sets up all of the banking, lines up all of the
Hmm.
contractors like the bookkeeping and all of that stuff. I oversee data management, the finances, of course, and add perspective, kind of like you said, around construction and whatnot. So
Yeah.
if there's a project that needs a little bit of rehab, usually I'm the go-to for providing quotes for what I think it
Hmm.
would cost to actually rehabilitate that unit. Although in general, we try to avoid rehabs at this point. We're looking for mostly B, C class, relatively turnkey. and then doing improvements later down the road. But those are probably my biggest roles. I am more so the integrator, tying everything
Mhm.
together. And then like a sounding board for my other two partners. They'll come to me because they're both more so visionary
Mhm.
types than anything. And so
Got it.
they may come up with a big grand idea, and they come to me to try and put it into tactical real world terms.
Got
It's
it.
funny. I always joke with them because as part of my role, I'm really good at shooting holes in things. Like I don't want to shoot down the whole idea. My job is just to say, okay, well, here's going to be a challenge. Here's going to be a challenge. Here's going to be a challenge. Right.
Yes.
So yeah,
And you are so important to every single team to have someone like you, Bobby. And I think your team must feel so lucky to kind of have you here. I think that is your experience and your wealth of knowledge is just so precious. I can definitely see why everyone will want you on their team, especially when it comes to raising private capital, right? We talk about people only invest with people that you know, you like, and you trust. And
yep.
knowing your experience, right? You are someone that, man, I would I would not hesitate to invest in a heartbeat, man. Like
Well, I
just knowing your
appreciate that.
experience,
We'll
like
have to do
it's
some business together at some point.
yeah, absolutely. We definitely need to do some business together. And this is why we got into these communities, this is why we talk and network. It's like I get to meet amazing people like you with awesome backgrounds and a kind heart, right? So maybe that's a good transition into, your role as a board of director on your local housing authority for Merced
Yeah.
County. Obviously, you're not talking in a public capacity right now, but tell us like what are your goals? Serving on a board of director for a local housing authority. Like we talk a lot about affordable housing and how there's a huge need. You mentioned like there's a big shortage here in California for housing. Like what are your goals and what kind of change are you trying to drive?
Yeah. So housing authority, that's a good one. Um, Housing authority. Oh, is my camera stuck, Kent?
I Your camera is a little stuck, but
Oh,
I
my
can still
bad.
hear you loud and clear, so we can
Okay,
still
good.
keep talking. Yep.
All right. Well, that's the important part.
Yes.
Okay. So, housing authorities serve a very important purpose in the community, as you know. And it was something that I came across really as I think we've all heard of Section 8 at some point in
Hmm.
time, heard that
Yep.
term, may not necessarily know exactly what it means, but we've heard it at some point in time. And so we've had something of um, a homelessness crisis in California, right? It's in the news frequently,
Hmm.
so people are aware that's going on.
Yep.
But that whole thing, that whole issue is very, very complicated, and it's not nearly as simple as most people think that it is.
Hmm.
And so I set out to do a little bit of research and figure out, okay, what is the solution here? What is the problem? How can I get involved? How can I help? And in my research, I found out how important the role of the housing authority is
Hmm.
in every jurisdiction. Um, and so, right off the bat, I started paying attention to the board meetings, reading the
Hmm.
minutes, getting up to speed on what they do and how they do it, and put in an application when a spot opened up on the board. So somebody had turned off, and so I went down to the county and filled out the application. I was interviewed by a small committee from the board of supervisors,
Hmm.
and they ended up selecting me and one other to come on the board as new board members.
Wow, that's super cool. And let's just maybe just talk a little bit about the relationships between the landlord and the housing authority, right? For some
Yeah.
folks that might not understand, like, why is there a housing authority? Why can't I just rent it out to a Section 8 renter, whatever that means, right? Why is the
Mhm.
housing authority kind of getting involved in that whole process? It's meant to be an open-ended question. Love to kind of hear your perspective there.
Yeah, sure. So the housing authority ultimately, their role is to verify that number one, the eligibility of the person receiving the voucher, and number two, to ensure a safe and habitable
Hmm.
environment for that tenant. So Section 8 properties go through an inspection to ensure
Hmm.
that they are, safe for occupancy. And depending on where you're at, the guidelines are pretty universal because they come down from
Yep.
HUD, from the federal government. But
Hmm.
the standards are pretty good. They're pretty high. Um, and if the housing authority is doing its job properly, nobody should ever want for repairs or anything that's
Hmm.
necessary for the function of their unit. Um,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, that is really I would say, the two biggest outcomes that a housing authority seeks. They seek to house as many eligible individuals as possible by providing them with the vouchers, and then also to ensure that the units that they're renting are safe.
Yes. And I think this is a really great benefit for people thinking about becoming a Section 8 landlord, right? Where this inspection is not really meant to be like a uncle, like a brother saying, like looking over your shoulders all the time. It's meant so that you actually get someone looking at your home on a yearly basis that actually might
Mhm.
help you keep up with the maintenance. And I think people like lose out on that benefit whenever they think about, oh, I got to deal with this, right? It's actually a really
Right.
good thing. You want to stay on top of these issues that might happen. And knowing that the tenant has been verified by the government source, now you know that that government-backed rent is actually coming to you on time and guaranteed every single month. So that's going to be a huge, huge benefit for anyone looking to invest in Section 8 here. Is there are programs in place to safeguard not only the tenant but also the landlord to kind of make it fair on all parties. And that's really what how you incentivize behavior to drive more supply into the market. Would you agree? Anything else you would add
Absolutely.
there? Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, the housing authority, at least from a landlord perspective, um, the things that we hear landlords say the most about why they like dealing with housing authority and or Section 8
Hmm.
is mostly to do with, number one, it's reliable income, right? The
Yep.
housing authority and the federal government doesn't generally miss payments. That's very reliable.
Yes.
And like you said, a lot of them do appreciate the fact that it gets essentially inspected for them, once a year.
And that is an amazing, amazing benefit. Do not miss out on that benefit, guys, for all the listeners that are watching right now and listening right now. It's you got to look into the inspection checklist. Obviously, you can't wing it, right? It's meant to be a checklist, it's meant to be a rigid process because that's how you ensure a high quality of living for a lot of the residents from the Section 8 program. So that's going to be really, really important. And one other thing that the housing authority does, and I've seen it for multiple counties and housing authorities, is you can actually go to their website and look up, hey, what the payment standards are. How much can you
Uh-huh.
expect to receive for rent for a particular zip code or maybe a city? It kind of differs by city and by county, where some might be zip code based, some might be city based. But that is something that for all the listeners right now, that's something you can do right now. You can kind of go in there, go to local housing authority and see if you can research some of these items because again, another benefit. You're not guessing at what rent you can get. You're more of like, hey, this is the ceiling of what I can expect to receive from the government, and you can work backwards on whether or not that rent is reasonable based on the market comps there. So I love that we went through that. Bobby, I know we're on affordable housing, but I definitely want to make sure we had a chance to talk about the nonprofit stuff that you're doing. So tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
the web development that you are helping out, you're volunteering your time for. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and how can people get involved.
Yeah, so this is a topic that I'm really passionate about as well, obviously, because I spend time working for this company Bitwise.
Hmm.
Their mission really resonated with me because I come from a community that's an
Hmm.
underdog community. Merced, California, usually if we're making it onto a list, it's usually not a good list. Fortunately, the last 10
Wow.
years we've made it onto some better lists like personal income growth. We ranked
Got it.
actually one of the highest in the nation. So we're on
Awesome.
our way up. But Bitwise started out of the Fresno area. Irma Olguin and Jake Soberall are the co-founders and CEOs
Hmm.
of the company. And they took this model where it's funny. They're actually a real estate company as well, if you can believe it. So they buy dilapidated buildings, rehab them, really nice too. I mean, if you saw these
Hmm.
buildings, you'd be amazed. Very modern architecture with a lot of artistic flair. It's amazing. Then they have this workforce development side that helps train people to give them programming and coding skills. The idea being that hopefully they'll spin off and create a company and become a tenant in the building.
Wow.
So
That's so cool. And so
it's a
smart.
really neat deal. And they found great success with it. They're expanding rapidly. In fact, they bought a big building downtown Toledo, historic building, huge. It's like 80,000 square feet or something. And which is funny because I'm in the process of buying a big portfolio in Toledo right now, actually. Um, but yeah, that part has been really cool. We're taking people that otherwise might not have had access to guided training, and giving it
Hmm.
to them. Right now it's all remote, so we're doing all the education over Zoom. But I mean,
Yep.
I've had students from South Africa.
Oh,
I've
wow.
had students from um, Chicago. I've had students from Detroit. I mean, all over the place, as well as Merced and some of our local areas. But it's been a really cool experience, and we kind of it's boot camp style, so it's quick paced, but
Hmm.
it gives you a guided exposure to programming, and we've seen some phenomenal outcomes for some people. Some of my earliest students are now founding companies, or they're now employed developers, with Bitwise, making amazing money that they never thought they would make as somebody living in Merced or Fresno.
Dude, what a beautiful story, man. Like, you must be so proud. Your family must be so proud. It's an incredible feeling when you're able to and like help so many people and literally change their lives, man, with actual technical skills that is going to benefit them. And it's almost like transferable, right? We're in this world of
Yeah.
big data, information, artificial intelligence. Like, these are going to be skills that are going to be in demand no matter what. And you are not only providing job security, you're providing them like a launch pad for growth where they will take these skills and start their own companies. How crazy is that? It's
That's
like
the
these
idea,
ideas,
man.
these
Yeah.
thoughts. Sometimes, without you, these thoughts and these opportunities never would have come up. And that is such a beautiful story, Bobby. Like, I'm so impressed, like hearing about your background and hearing all the things you do and hearing about the change you're trying to drive at your local housing authority. It's so beautiful. It's You're gonna leave behind a legacy that a lot of people will remember, and I can't thank you enough, right? I thanked you before we got on the podcast, but seriously, thank you for what you do. Without people like you, like my family and I, we would have never had a safe home, a safe, stable home for us to kind of grow up in and develop these opportunities, right? And what you're doing is you're going even a step further, not just providing housing, but you're providing these skills, and teaching these skills to people, to children that have this need, and you're helping them succeed.
I'm trying,
Wow,
man.
it's just
I'm
so great.
trying.
It's so cool, it's so beautiful, and it makes life so meaningful.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I don't do well with compliments. I'm over here blushing. But yeah, man, I'm just trying to make the community a better place. It's you're not remembered by how many rental units you owned. You're remembered by the impact you had in your community, and that's how I want to be remembered, as somebody that made an impact.
That's right. I mean, and I usually like asking like a mindset related question to kind of end every single podcast, right? What has been like, have you ever had any like epiphanies or moments where it's just like, hey, I'm not scared of this stuff anymore? Because a lot of new investors, they just don't know what they want to do. They're all over the place. They're too scared, have analysis paralysis. Have you ever had that
Yeah.
moment where you're like, wow, I'm so scared, but here's how I'm going to do and persevere? Like, tell us a little bit about your mindset development over the years.
Oh gosh. Um, I've had so many epiphanies over the years, but if I had to boil it down for somebody that's new in real estate, Pace has said this, so have several other people, but
Hmm.
um, it's take scary action.
Yes.
And what that means is that jump in and do something. Pick a path, learn it, start doing it. There's no teacher like experience. There just isn't. You can study all the things and all the books you want, and not to say that books aren't good. I read a lot of books, so
Hmm.
you want to have the knowledge base, but what you don't want to end up with is all this knowledge and no action. And I would say that jumping in, and especially teaming up, there
Yes.
is some extreme benefits to having some level of accountability by teaming up with somebody, even if
Hmm.
it's just to do like a daily check-in. Hey,
Yeah.
did you make any calls to try and reach some sellers today? What did you do today to further what I know your goal is? Um, that and teaming up with people to actually try and do whatever your passion is. For some people, they like wholesale. Some people, they
Hmm.
like construction, so they do fix and flips. um I would say out of everything that somebody can do, wholesale is probably the easiest, lowest cost way
Hmm.
to start learning and getting involved. But yeah, take scary action, jump in. Don't be reckless. Don't go spending all your money or something.
Yep.
Trying to chase it, but um, take action. You'll learn a lot. There's no better teacher than experience. That's
I
that's
love
what
that.
would be my boiled down mindset.
I love that, Bobby. And I think for people like as much as you can listen to this, you got to take action, right? Here on this podcast, we talk a lot about affordable housing, but we blend in a little bit of real estate investing because
Mhm.
sometimes I understand that people don't think like affordable housing is the sexiest thing in the world, right? Sometimes there's a bad connotation with Section 8, but we're here to bust those myths. But we're also here to pull back the current and share with people like why you can be successful with Section 8. Like a lot of people are guessing on the rents. You can have a number that's displayed on a website that tells exactly what you can get with Section 8. So that takes a little bit of fear out. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go screen your tenants and do all the right things and manage your rehabs properly. But every single podcast episode, every single action you take, you're going to learn something. And that
Mhm.
is going to help you build your story. And as you think about scaling your business, or hopefully not everyone just wants one rental, and chances are you listening to this podcast, you probably just don't want just one rental. But this is going to help you build that experience and build your credibility so that you can raise private capital like what Bobby is doing nowadays. So take action, get that experience, and you're going to have something really, really cool to talk about. Even if it's a mistake, even though it's going to be a learning no matter what. So, hey, Bobby, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Of
You have
course, Ken.
provided a value packed episode. I can definitely vouch for that. Just hearing all the content, just trying to soak up everything at once, man. So, thank you again for coming on the show, and hopefully, we'll have you back at some point once you're
Yeah,
kind of like spend a little bit more time in local housing authority, and we would love to see where this raw land deal goes. That would be pretty cool.
absolutely. Anytime.
All right. Thanks a lot. Have a good
All
one.
right. Thank you, Ken.